Great. Good morning, everybody. This is Mark Scott. I want to thank you for giving us 30 minutes of your time this morning for our SQLSoft3 webinar on what are collations and how they're used in SQL Server databases. You'll be on mute throughout the webinar this morning. If you've got a question, please do use the question dialog window in your GoToWebinar interface. MikeCulver, who I've known for over 20 years, is going to be doing the presentation this morning. And collation is something that I had the unfortunate pleasure of having to dive into in great detail several years back when I was working with a CRM database, Microsoft CRM database, that ended up needing to talk to a Great Plains database, and we had to build some reports and so forth. But anyway, Mike's going to go into some of the gory details, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everyone. So we are going to be discussing in the next 30 minutes what are SQL Server collations, defining them, looking at them, and what you will need to do to choose the appropriate SQL Server collation for an instance of SQL Server you are installing, and how the collation that you choose affects searching, joining, grouping, sorting, anything where SQL Server has to determine what is unique in a set of data. And if you do have a collation conflict, Mark just mentioned one between two different databases that are the database storage backends for two different applications, what do you do if there's a conflict? And you may decide that you need to change a collation of an existing database or SQL Server or a few individual columns. And when you do that, what are the issues that you will face? So first of all, recently I, like Mark, had an instance where I needed to help out a customer with a collation issue. They had a tax software application, a corporate tax software application that was installed on a SQL Server with one collation, but they were not getting the results they needed. They were getting errors in some instances, and so in further investigation it was determined that the database collation that they had selected, the default for that server, was not supported by the tax software. So this tax software database was very complex. It had over 1,900 tables in it, hundreds of stored procedures, views, and other objects, and it wasn't, you know, we could pump the data from one database into another database. We could change the collation. We could go about it a few different ways, but what we decided to do in the end was to change the collation of the columns and the database, and we eventually wound up having to change the collation of the SQL Server itself. So I'll get into a little bit also of what that experience that I had, and discuss some of the issues that we went through there. So what is collation? SQL Server has what are called code pages that are similar to Windows code pages or locales. A numeric value is assigned to each character. Now Unicode characters, which you see in this screenshot here, all have the same values associated with them. Unicode characters are always the same, no matter what. But the non-Unicode characters, whether we are referring to those as ANSI characters in Windows or ASCII characters, the old way of saying that in DOS or early versions of Windows, those numeric values can change depending on which code value that you select, or which, not the numeric value that's changing, but rather which character is associated with that numeric value may change. So the 7-bit characters are pretty much all going to be the same, but when you start getting into the 8-bit characters, then you will have changes, and many of those are going to be accented characters, or the characters that have other diacritical marks associated with them, such as umlauts. And so also the code page has to do with how data is going to be sorted. We, speaking English in the United States, will sort one way, But a user in Spain may have their data sorted in a slightly different way. It may look odd to us, but it's appropriate for the Spanish language being spoken in that region. Case sensitivity is also something that is governed by collation. How do how do uppercase characters match up to lowercase characters? Is an uppercase A interpreted as being equivalent to a lowercase a when it comes to grouping, sorting, and determining what is something equal to something else? And then we have, is accent sensitivity go into, how does accent sensitivity figure into, is something equal to something else? We in the United States are not often, not in all cases, but are often not used to using keyboards that have European, what we would consider to be European characters on them. We can dig in and find those characters if we want to, but we're not typically using those keyboards. So we're going to type in a city name like Zurich without the umlaut over the U. A user in a European country is probably just used to typing in Zurich with the umlaut. It's just second nature to them. Their keyboards are set up to easily type those characters. So when we do a search, how do those values compare to each other? Accent sensitivity determines, is the Zurich without the umlaut going to compare equally to the Zurich with the umlaut or not? So when choosing a collation, if you are running the SQL Server setup installation to install a new version of SQL Server in a new instance, you will be presented with the choice of which collation do you want to use when installing SQL Server. The default choice that you are presented with will depend on your Windows locale. Here in the United States, we are given the SQL Latin 1 choice as the default, and most people just accept that. So you will need to decide this based on where are your users, what kinds of keyboards are they using, what kinds of searches will your users be doing, how do these results have to match up. Do you have users all over the world where in some parts of the world typing in a character with a diacritical mark is just second nature to them? Do you have users in the United States where typing in a name or something with an accent may not be as readily apparent, may be uncommon? So what are the requirements of your application? Do you have an off-the-shelf application like CRM, Great Plains, or the tax software that I was involved with not too long ago? Or are you developing an application in-house, and what are its requirements? What are the requirements of your users? Probably uncommon these days to see anything that's too case sensitive, but the accent sensitivity part probably will play a big part of it, because the choice that you're given by default in the United States is to preserve accent sensitivity. So in these two little screenshots here on the left side, we see that a Windows control panel, regional settings, and so this is where you will choose where you are, and the language for non-Unicode programs is set to US English by default. You may change that locale, and depending on what that value is will be the determining factor in what you are presented with as the default collation in your SQL Server setup. So on the right side we see the SQL Server 2014 setup, and one of the choices that we make here is the collation. We're presented with the SQL Latin 1 General CP1 CIAS by default. On the screen where you make the choice to customize the database engine collation, notice down at the bottom you have all the SQL collations, and it specifically says that these are used for backward compatibility, but this is still the default. If you choose US English as your Windows collation, this is still the default for SQL Server 2014, and probably will be going forward. I have not heard of any plans to change that. So And then up at the top of this Customize dialog, you see that you can also choose a Windows collation. And even if you're just in Canada, and you have Canada chosen as the Windows locale, you will be presented with a Windows collation as the default, and that does not compare favorably to the U.S. English SQL collation at the bottom of this window. So notice in the description, case insensitive, so uppercase characters will match lowercase characters in an equality test, but accent sensitive, diacritical marks will not compare to the corresponding character that does not have a diacritical mark. Now, a couple of other properties of collations that we will not be going into any detail on today unless you have questions about them. Conotype sensitivity only has to do with code pages for the Japanese languages. Which Japanese code pages are you using, and do you want different conotypes to be sensitive to each other or not? Width sensitivity may be something that you come across. How do 8-bit characters, 1-byte characters compare to 16-bit characters? If you have a given character in the in your local character set, 8-bit character set, does that compare to the same character that's in the Unicode character set favorably or not? And so width insensitivity is selected by default. How this affects how you're going to be doing these searches? Well, with accent sensitivity, Zurich without the umlaut will be compared false to Zurich with the umlaut. In order for those to compare favorably to each other, you need to have accent insensitivity. And in the case of the tax software that my client was using, they had accent insensitivity selected by default for their SQL Server as the SQL Server collation, because that was just easier for them. They had users in all different parts of the world. They wanted to be able to run reports where a user could type in a word this way and be able to grab all the different versions of the same spelling. But the tax software that they were using only supported accent sensitivity, so we had to change that collation. Joining, when you join two tables together based on a criteria, in this case, table 1 string column equals table 2 string column. First of all, assuming they have the same collation, how are they going to compare in terms of case sensitivity and accent sensitivity? Which rows will match up? In a group by, you're dividing data up into groups. So if in this case, if we group by city, will the Zurich without the umlaut and the Zurich with the umlaut be in the same group, which they will be if you use an accent insensitive collation, or will they have two different groups, which will be true with the default's accent sensitive collation? And also sorting, order by, alphabetically, but when you get into the 8-bit characters, then those will be sorted after the corresponding 7-bit characters. So U without the umlaut comes before U with the umlaut. So these are all your considerations when choosing a collation. What are your users expecting? How are you going to be reporting on this data? What's unique? If you have a collation conflict, if in that join example, for example, if we were to compare columns that have different collations, we might get an error message from SQL Server. It says, cannot resolve the collation conflict. One column has accent sensitivity, the other column does not have accent sensitivity, accent insensitive. So this is the message that you will see if you are having collation conflicts. This is returned as an exception back to the client. So if you have just changed your collation and you get this message, hopefully this is something that is coming up during testing and not something that your users are seeing. So you will want to thoroughly test any changes to collation to make sure that you've resolved any collation conflicts. And even if the characters that you're trying to compare to each other are all otherwise the same, you don't have any accented characters, if just by having the two columns have different collations, this is what you will see. That's all that's necessary for this error to appear. So how do you resolve this? Well, you can use the collate clause in your code to assert or to cast that data has a certain collation, even if it doesn't have that in the table. Or you can permanently change the collation of columns and change the default collation of the database and of the SQL Server. When you change collation, each column will retain the old collation that it has. So you can change the collation at the database level, but that's just the default. The existing columns, existing data will retain the old collation. Excuse me. Excuse me. So, and you may find that changing the collate, putting the collate clause into your code is a lot of work, because you have to then change all your code. And of course, if you're using off-the-shelf software, you can't change that code. So what do you do? So when you're changing the SQL Server database, or the collation, or a database's default collation, existing columns retain the old collation. You have to change everything in your code, cast everything with all the code with the to change the old way to the new way, or you can use alter table statements with the alter column clause to change the collation of individual columns. Now, I'm assuming here that you aren't deciding that you're not going to bulk copy all of your data out to text files and then copy it back in, because that, in a complex database or something with a lot of data, that's a lot of work. Of course, this is a lot of work also, but we made a calculated decision that this was changing the metadata, changing the properties of the tables and the columns and so forth, was just an easier way to go about it than to bulk copy all the data out and bulk copy it back in, especially when you're dealing with gigabytes and gigabytes of data. So you're changing columns, and that's the only change you're making to tables. You're otherwise not going to be touching the data. But with views and functions and stored procedures, since those definitions are all just SQL statement definitions, those can easily be dropped. You may be able to drop types depending on the dependency of tables to those types, and make the changes to any code that needs to be changed, and then recreate those when you're finished. But making the change, dropping all of the things that you don't need, right, that you can easily get away from to release the dependency on the table, alter the columns on the table, and then recreate everything. Of course, if you have indexes and constraints, you'll need to drop those. Any index that exists that's dependent on a column that has a particular collation, that index has to go. And so constraints that are based on indexes, same thing. Other constraints that may have to be dropped are check constraints. You're checking the data against a function or a constant, and that may have an assumption that it's a particular collation, so that may have to go. You may also have to drop foreign key constraints. Drop all of the objects that you can get away with dropping. Don't touch the data. Alter the columns, alter the tables, and then recreates everything. Now you're managing a lot of code if in a complex database, hundreds of objects, and it can take a long time with a lot of data because you are dropping indexes and recreating them. But it's sometimes necessary, but you need to be prepared for that. You may have to tell your users in your management that, hey, this database is going to be offline for a day in order to make these changes. So even after you change all of these definitions, go through all of this, you've changed all the columns, you've changed any code that needs changing, you've recreated it, you've recreated all of the indexes and constraints. We were scratching our heads because we had done all of that. We saw that all of our columns had the correct new collation, and we were still getting that collation conflict exception when we tested out certain reports. Well, in our case, a report was based on a view in one case, and that view did a join between two different tables. And what we suspect was going on was that SQL Server was using the tempDB database behind the scenes. So if your code is using the tempDB database and that tempDB database is different, has a different collation than your application database, once again you may need to change some code to cast those expressions, columns, as the appropriate new collation. But we couldn't do that because of the nature of the software wasn't customizable. It was the off-the-shelf software. So what did we do? We had a tempDB database that was one collation, and we had our user database that was another collation. You may also run into this problem if you have code that consolidates data from multiple databases. You have a funneling effect of taking data from many different places and putting it into one place. For example, if you are staging data and cleaning it prior to putting that data, for example, into a data warehouse, what is your cleaning process going to be? Well, first of all, what is your requirement for a collation in the data warehouse? What are you going to be using there for a collation? And then are you going to have to write code as part of your staging that is going to change that data to the appropriate collation? So when resolving collation conflicts with tempDB, so you have one application database that's one collation, and you have a tempDB database that's a different collation. What do? So first of all, let's review tempDB. tempDB is a system database that is rebuilt every time the SQL Server service starts. So if you were working in tempDB when the SQL Server service stopped, any of those tables are going to be gone, cleaned out, when the service restarts. It's a temporary database. It's just there to hold sets of data temporarily while you work with them or while SQL Server works with them behind the scenes. The tempDB database is created with the default server level collation. That is, there's no way of changing that. That's just the way it is. That default server level collation is a property of the model database, and you may be saying, what if I were to just change it in the model database? Well, you cannot change the collation of the model database. That's the one thing about that you cannot change. So if you can't change any code, but you are still getting a collation conflict between the application database and tempDB, you may have to take the step of changing your default server level collation. Because SQL Server is just going to use tempDB to behind the scenes for sorting, doing anything it needs to do. When it was doing a join between those two tables, it may not have had a really good index to use in joining, so it may have, and if there was a lot of data, it may have been wanting to create hash tables or tables to do sorting with behind the scenes. So, and it was using tempDB for that and running into that collation conflict. So in the end, we really had to change the server level collation. And this is a big deal because you have to back up, detach your application databases, your user databases. So assuming that you've taken the step of changing all of your metadata in the database, all of those column definitions have changed, the database has the new collation, but the server level still has the old collation. Back up those databases, detach them, otherwise ensure their safety. Now, one thing that you need to know is when you're going to run setup from a command line, you're not going to copy any new binaries from the installation media. You're just going to run setup to make this change. And as part of making this change, it will rebuild the master database that controls the entire functioning of your SQL Server. any databases that exist will be dropped. And if you have database files located in the default directory where databases are located on that SQL Server, those database files will be deleted. So make a copy of those database files, detach them, copy them someplace else, back them up, put the backup someplace safe, then run setup with the appropriate command line arguments that will rebuild master and give you the new collation at the server level. That takes just a few minutes. Once you're finished with that, you can verify the server properties that the new collation has been created, installed. Then you can restore or attach those existing application databases that have the new collation. Now everything should match. TempDB should match the user databases, and we tested out our reports, and that one report that was giving us the error before tested just fine. Everything was great. But it requires a lot of testing because you want to get this error at your client. You don't want the user, the customer, the person using the application to get the error at their client. So that's it. And that is the brief story of a very complex subject, collation. Now, in the SQL Server administration course that I'll be delivering in a few weeks, you will be talking about collation just as an installation property, but you will not. It doesn't go into any detail. It certainly doesn't go into this level of detail. And this is something that people run into. They have to change the collation, but it's just a real difficult, time-consuming effort. So what do they do? And so that was my intention today, was to give you a brief overview of what will be happening if you have to take those steps and the time-consuming process that it can be. And I hope that helps. Thank you very much.